Matthew Ingram's hands were trembling as he tried to light the oil lamp, the tiny flame dancing precariously in the chill Montana evening air. His three young sons watched in silence from the rough-hewn table, their dinner plates empty save for a few crumbs of cornbread. It had been 2 years since typhoid fever had taken their mother, and tonight, like every night, Matthew was struggling to fill the gaping hole her absence had left in their lives. "Boys," he said, his voice rough as the weathered cedar boards that made up their cabin walls, "it's time for evening prayers." Montana Territory, 1878. The land was unforgiving, but so was grief. Matthew had learned to live with both, though neither had gotten easier. At 34, he'd carved out a modest cattle ranch 20 miles from the nearest town, raising his sons Samuel 10, David 8, and Joseph 6, as best he could while trying to keep the ranch from falling into ruin. "Pa, do we have to?" Samuel asked, the eldest showing the first signs of rebellion that seemed to come with his approaching adolescence. "Yes, son, we do." Matthew pulled off his worn leather work gloves and set them aside. His hands were calloused from rope burns and barbed wire, from breaking horses and building fences. But they were clumsy when it came to guiding 3 boys through prayers, through life without a mother. The boys reluctantly folded their hands on the table, a habit Matthew had been trying to instill since their mother passed. But tonight, like most nights, their eyes wandered, their attention scattered like leaves in autumn wind. "Dear Lord," Matthew began, his eyes closed while his sons remained stubbornly open. "We thank you for the food on our table, for the roof over our heads," and a sharp knock at the door interrupted his words. Matthew's eyes flew open, his hand automatically reaching for the rifle that hung above the fireplace. "Who could that be?" David whispered, eyes wide. "Stay here," Matthew ordered, rising from his chair. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and unexpected visitors after dark rarely brought good news in this part of the territory. He approached the door cautiously, rifle in hand. "Who's there?" he called out. "Please," came a woman's voice, strained and desperate. "I need help." Matthew hesitated, then slid back the wooden bolt. The door creaked open to reveal a woman in her mid-20s, her dress mudded and torn at the hem. She was shivering, a small leather satchel clutched in one hand, her other arm cradling what appeared to be a bundle of blankets. "I'm sorry to disturb you," she said, her voice trembling as much as her body. "My wagon, the wheel broke about a mile back. I've been walking and I saw your light." Her voice trailed off as she swayed slightly. Matthew immediately set the rifle aside and reached out to steady her. "Come in, miss. It's freezing out there." As she stepped into the lamplight, he could see her more clearly. Her hair was the color of wheat ready for harvest, pulled back in a loose bun with tendrils escaping around her face. Her eyes were a clear, determined blue, though currently shadowed with exhaustion. The bundle in her arms moved slightly, and Matthew realized with a start that it was a baby. "I'm Julia Wilson," she said, attempting to straighten her posture despite her evident fatigue. "And this is my daughter, Emma." The 3 boys had abandoned their chairs and were now staring openly at the newcomers. It had been years since a woman had entered their cabin. "Matthew Ingram," he replied, suddenly acutely aware of the disarray of their home, the unwashed dishes piled in the basin, the mending left half done by the hearth, the thin layer of dust on the shelves. "These are my sons Samuel, David, and Joseph." Julia nodded at each boy in turn, offering a gentle smile that seemed to transform her weary face. "Thank you for letting us in, Mr. Ingram. Just Matthew, please." He gestured to the chair he had vacated. "Sit, you look like you're about to fall over." As Julia settled into the chair, the baby in her arms began to fuss. Samuel, usually the most reserved of the 3 boys, took a cautious step forward. "How old is she?" he asked. 6 months, Julia answered, gently rocking the infant. "She's usually good-natured, but it's been a long, cold journey." "Where are you headed?" Matthew asked, putting the kettle on the wood stove. Julia hesitated, something flickering across her expression that Matthew couldn't quite read. "I'm going to stay with my cousin in Helena. I'm starting over." There was a story there, Matthew knew, but it wasn't his place to pry. Life in the West was often about starting over, running from something or toward something, sometimes both at once. "Helena's still a good 3 days' ride from here," Matthew said, preparing a cup of the precious tea he kept for special occasions. "And that's with a working wagon." "I know," Julia said softly, looking down at her daughter. "I was hoping. Perhaps you might know of someone nearby who could help repair my wheel. I have money to pay." Matthew ran a hand through his dark hair, considering. The nearest wheelwright was in town, 20 miles away, and with winter setting in early this year, traveling back and forth would be risky, especially with a woman and infant. "The weather's turning," he said finally. "Fixing that wagon and getting you safely to Helena before the pass is close." "It's not likely, not this time of year." Julia's shoulders slumped slightly, but her chin remained lifted, a quiet determination in her posture that reminded Matthew painfully of his late wife, Caroline. "You and your daughter are welcome to stay here until spring," he found himself saying, the words surprising him as much as they clearly surprised her. "We have a small room off the kitchen. It's not much, but it's warm and dry." "I couldn't impose," Julia began. "It's not an imposition," Matthew cut in. It would be nice to have someone to help with the boys, and I could use a hand around the house." He glanced around at the state of the cabin, feeling a flush of embarrassment. "As you can see, I'm not particularly skilled at keeping things in order." Julia looked at him for a long moment, assessing. Then her gaze moved to the 3 boys who were still watching her with undisguised curiosity. "I'd be grateful," she said finally, "and I'm a good cook." "And I can mend and clean, and Pa was trying to teach us to pray," Joseph interrupted, his 6-year-old face earnest, "but he's not very good at it." "Joseph," Matthew admonished, feeling his face grow hot. But Julia smiled a real smile this time, one that reached her eyes and seemed to brighten the entire room. "Is that so?" "Ma used to do it," Samuel explained, his usual reticence forgotten, "but she went to heaven. Pa tries, but he always says the same things, and sometimes he forgets the words." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Matthew cleared his throat, embarrassed by his son's candor and the sudden vulnerability he felt standing in his own kitchen. "Well," Julia said, breaking the silence, "perhaps I could help with that too, if your father doesn't mind." Matthew looked at this stranger, this woman who had appeared on his doorstep like an answer to a prayer he hadn't known how to articulate. "I'd be much obliged," he said softly. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, dusting the Montana landscape with white. Inside the cabin, something else entirely was beginning to take root. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the world transformed by a thin blanket of snow that sparkled in the early light. Matthew had risen before dawn, as was his custom, to tend to the livestock. When he returned to the cabin, stomping snow from his boots on the porch, he was greeted by the unfamiliar scent of fresh biscuits and the sound of his son's voices, not quarreling, as was often the case, but engaged in actual conversation. He paused at the door, something tightening in his chest. For a moment, he could almost imagine Caroline was inside, her presence filling the cabin with warmth and order. But it wasn't Caroline. It was Julia Wilson, a woman he'd known for less than a day, yet who had somehow managed to accomplish what he'd been struggling with for 2 years, creating a sense of normalcy for his boys. He pushed open the door to find the kitchen transformed. The dishes had been washed and put away, the table set with their mismatched plates, and Julia stood at the stove, her back to him as she flipped what appeared to be flapjacks in Caroline's old cast-iron skillet. His sons were seated at the table, Emma cooing contentedly in a makeshift cradle fashioned from a drawer padded with blankets. "Good morning," Julia said, turning at the sound of his entrance. Her hair was neatly braided, her face flushed from the heat of the stove, and she wore one of Caroline's old aprons over her wrinkled dress. "Morning," Matthew managed, hanging his hat and coat by the door. "This is unexpected." "I hope you don't mind," Julia said, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her features. "I thought I'd make myself useful right away." "Mind, no, not at all." Matthew approached the stove, inhaling deeply. "It smells wonderful." "Pa, Miss Julia made real breakfast," Joseph exclaimed. With sugar on the flapjacks, I found some preserves in the root cellar, Julia explained. I hope that was all right. More than all right, Matthew assured her, feeling strangely self-conscious as he took his place at the head of the table. We don't often indulge in such luxuries. Well, I figured a special breakfast was in order, since we're going to be sharing a home for the winter. Julia brought the skillet to the table, sliding a flapjack onto each plate. And please, just Julia is fine. The boys dug in enthusiastically, and Matthew found himself watching Julia as she moved about the kitchen with an easy grace. There was something both heartening and painful about seeing a woman in this space again, handling the utensils Caroline had once used, filling the void that had been gaping for so long. I thought I'd go out today and see about your wagon, Matthew said, after the boys had finished eating and gone to get dressed for their chores. See if the wheel can be salvaged or if we need to fashion a new one. Julia looked up from where she was washing dishes. You don't have to do that right away. I know you must have work of your own. The cattle are settled in the lower pasture for the winter, and the most pressing repairs are done, Matthew replied. Besides, we should retrieve your belongings before the snow gets any deeper. Julia nodded, her expression guarded. Thank you, that's very kind. There was that reserve again, that sense that she was holding something back. Matthew found himself wondering what had brought her to this remote part of Montana, traveling alone with an infant as winter approached. But he didn't ask. Everyone in the West had their stories, their reasons for leaving behind whatever life they'd known before. He certainly had his. The boys and I will head out after they finish their morning chores, he said instead. Will you be all right here alone? We'll be just fine, Julia assured him, a genuine smile softening her features. Perhaps I'll see about tackling some of that mending I spotted by the hearth. Matthew felt a rush of gratitude so intense it almost embarrassed him. That would be helpful, thank you. 2 hours later, Matthew and his sons were trudging through the snow toward the spot where Julia had abandoned her wagon. The boys were unusually animated, peppering him with questions about their new houseguests. Is Miss Julia going to stay forever? David asked, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. No, son, just until spring when the pass is clear and she can continue to Helena. But why is she going there? Samuel pressed. Don't she have a husband somewhere? Matthew gave his eldest a sharp look. That's not our business, Samuel. Miss Julia is our guest, and we're going to treat her with respect and not pry into her affairs. I like her, Joseph declared, skipping ahead through the snow. She smiles more than you do, Pa. Matthew couldn't argue with that. Since Caroline's death, smiles had been in short supply in the Ingram household. He'd done his best, but the weight of grief and responsibility had worn him down, leaving little room for joy. They found the wagon about a mile from their cabin, partially buried under fresh snow. It was a small, canvas-covered cart, the type often used by settlers making the journey west. The rear wheel had indeed broken, the wooden spokes splintered beyond repair. We'll need to build a new one, Matthew murmured, examining the damage. Can we, Pa? David asked excitedly. I want to help. We all will, Matthew assured him, already mentally cataloging the wood they had available. For now, let's gather Miss Julia's belongings and get them back to the cabin. There wasn't much inside the wagon, a small trunk of clothing, a few cooking utensils, a worn Bible, and a framed daguerreotype that Matthew purposely didn't examine too closely. The boys helped load everything onto the sled they'd brought, and they began the trek back home. As they approached the cabin, Matthew noticed smoke rising steadily from the chimney, and through the window, he caught a glimpse of Julia moving about inside. The sight stirred something in him, a longing he'd thought had died along with Caroline. Pa, Samuel said, interrupting his thoughts. If Miss Julia stays until spring, will she teach us more prayers? The ones Ma used to say. Matthew looked down at his son, seeing the hope in his young face. I expect she might, if you ask her nicely. Good, Samuel nodded decisively, 'cause I'm starting to forget some of the words Ma said. And I don't want to forget. Matthew swallowed hard, reaching out to ruffle his son's hair. Neither do I, son, neither do I. That evening, after the boys had helped bring in Julia's belongings, and the whole family had enjoyed a proper supper rabbit stew with dumplings that Julia had somehow conjured from their meager stores. Matthew found himself once again attempting to lead evening prayers. "Boys, fold your hands," he instructed as they gathered around the table. The lamp cast a warm glow over their faces, and for once they complied without argument, perhaps because Julia was watching. "Dear Lord," Matthew began, his usual formula feeling stiff and inadequate. "We thank you for may I," Julia interrupted gently, her eyes meeting his across the table. Matthew nodded, relief washing over him. Julia smiled and turned to the boys. "When I was a little girl, my mother taught me that prayer isn't just about saying the right words. It's about talking to God from your heart. Why don't we each say something we're thankful for tonight?" The boys looked uncertain, but Julia continued, folding her hands and closing her eyes. "I'll start. Dear Lord, I'm thankful for the kindness of strangers who have opened their home to Emma and me. I'm thankful for warm shelter on a cold night and for new friends." She opened her eyes and looked at Joseph, the youngest. "Your turn." Joseph screwed up his face in concentration. "Dear God, I'm thankful for Miss Julia's flapjacks, and for baby Emma, 'cause she's real cute when she smiles." David went next. "I'm thankful that it snowed, 'cause now maybe Pa will let us go sledding on the hill, and I'm thankful that Miss Julia knows how to make dumplings." Samuel was more thoughtful. "I'm thankful that we're all healthy, and that Miss Julia might stay all winter to help Pa, 'cause he gets real tired sometimes." Finally, all eyes turned to Matthew. He cleared his throat, suddenly finding it difficult to speak. "I'm thankful for my sons," he said gruffly, "and for unexpected blessings that come when they're most needed." Julia nodded encouragingly. "And now we ask for God's blessing and protection through the night. Amen." "Amen," the boys echoed, and Matthew found himself joining in, the familiar word feeling somehow new on his tongue. As the boys prepared for bed with less argument than usual, Matthew noticed Julia standing by the hearth, gently rocking Emma and staring into the flames. There was a sadness in her posture, a weight that seemed at odds with the capable, cheerful woman who had taken charge of his household. "You have a way with them," Matthew said, approaching her. "The boys, I mean, they haven't been this well behaved in a long time." Julia looked up, a small smile touching her lips. "They're good boys, they just need a little guidance." "Something I've apparently been lacking in," Matthew admitted ruefully. "Not at all," Julia protested. "You've kept this ranch running and raised 3 healthy sons on your own." "That's no small feat, Matthew." The sound of his name on her lips sent an unexpected warmth through him. "Still, having you here, it makes a difference. I can see it already." Julia's smile faltered slightly and she looked back toward the fire. "I'm glad to be useful after everything." She trailed off, and Matthew knew he was seeing a glimpse of whatever pain she carried. "Julia," he said softly, "I won't ask about what brought you here, but if you ever want to talk about it." "Thank you," she whispered, not meeting his eyes, "but some stories are better left untold." Matthew nodded, respecting her privacy even as curiosity gnawed at him. "Well, I should check on the boys. Good night, Julia. Good night, Matthew." As he turned to leave, he heard her begin to sing softly to Emma a lullaby his own mother had sung to him, and that Caroline had later sung to their sons. The sweet, sad melody followed him down the hallway, wrapping around his heart like a vine taking root. The days began to settle into a rhythm as November deepened toward December. Each morning, Matthew would rise before dawn to tend to the livestock, returning to find breakfast waiting and his sons already dressed and ready for their lessons. Julia had discovered that the boys' education had been somewhat neglected since their mother's death, and she had taken it upon herself to remedy this situation. "Samuel can barely write his letters," she told Matthew one evening as they sat by the fire after the boys had gone to bed. Emma was asleep in her makeshift cradle, and Julia was darning a pile of socks that had accumulated over the past months. "And David doesn't know his multiplication tables. Joseph is bright but needs consistent instruction." Matthew felt a pang of guilt. "Caroline used to teach them, after she passed, I tried to continue, but there never seemed to be enough time. The ranch takes so much work, and without her." I understand, Julia said gently, her hands never ceasing their steady movement with the needle, and I'm not criticizing. I'm just saying I can help with this while I'm here. Matthew watched her for a moment, the firelight casting a golden glow on her hair. In the 2 weeks since she'd arrived, the cabin had been transformed. It was clean and orderly, the cupboards organized, the floors swept. Meals appeared regularly, the mending was caught up, and the boys were noticeably calmer. It was as if a piece that had been missing from their lives had suddenly been restored. You've done so much already, Matthew said. I don't know how to thank you. Julia looked up, her blue eyes reflecting the flames. You've given Emma and me shelter for the winter. I'm simply earning our keep. It's more than that, Matthew insisted. You've brought life back into this home. The boys are thriving with you here. A faint blush colored Julia's cheeks, and she dropped her gaze back to her darning. They're wonderful children. They just needed a woman's touch. The phrase hung in the air between them, laden with meaning neither was ready to acknowledge. The wheel is nearly finished, Matthew said, changing the subject. Another day or two of work and your wagon will be ready for spring. There's no rush, Julia replied, her voice carefully neutral. We have months before the mountain passes clear. Matthew nodded, trying to ignore the relief he felt at her words. The thought of Julia and Emma leaving had become increasingly difficult to contemplate. As November gave way to December, the first major snowstorm of the season descended upon them. For 3 days, the wind howled around the cabin, piling snow against the walls and windows until they were effectively cut off from the outside world. Will the cattle be all right? Julia asked on the second day, as Matthew returned from tending to the animals in the nearby barn. They're in the sheltered valley, he assured her, stomping snow from his boots. They know how to huddle together for warmth, and I've left them plenty of hay. The enforced confinement brought the family closer together. Julia taught the boys to make paper snowflakes to decorate the windows. Matthew pulled out the fiddle he hadn't touched since Caroline's death and played simple tunes while the boys clapped along. In the evenings, Julia continued to lead them in prayers, each person sharing their thoughts and gratitude before saying good night. On the third evening of the storm, after the boys were asleep, Matthew found Julia sitting alone at the table, a piece of paper and pencil before her. Writing a letter, he asked, taking a seat across from her. To my cousin in Helena, Julia explained, setting the pencil down. Explaining that I won't arrive until spring. Matthew nodded, noticing the hesitation in her manner. Is she expecting you? Julia bit her lip, then sighed. Not exactly. We haven't been in touch for years, but she's the only family I have left who might take me in. Might. Matthew echoed, concern furrowing his brow. It's complicated, Julia admitted. My family, they didn't approve of my marriage, cut ties with me. My cousin Charlotte was the only one who even wrote to me afterward, though the letters stopped coming eventually. Matthew remained silent, sensing she needed to speak but not wanting to push. My husband, Thomas, was a good man, Julia continued after a moment, her voice soft. But he had a wild streak, loved gambling, loved risk. We moved around a lot following his fortunes. When I became pregnant with Emma, he promised we'd settle down, find a real home. Her eyes grew distant. He was killed in a saloon fight 3 months before she was born, shot over a card game in Billings. I'm sorry, Matthew said, the words inadequate for the loss she described. Julia's laugh was brittle. The irony is he'd won that night, had enough money for us to start fresh. The man he beat couldn't accept losing, came back with a gun. She toyed with her pencil. After Emma was born, I tried to make a go of it in Billings, but a widow with a newborn. The options aren't pleasant. Matthew understood immediately what she was implying. A young, attractive widow without family support would have few respectable ways to support herself and a child in a frontier town. So you decided to find your cousin, he concluded. Julia nodded. It was a risk. She might turn us away, but I couldn't stay in Billings, and I had nowhere else to go. The admission of her vulnerability moved something deep within Matthew. This woman who had brought such competence and warmth to his home had been running on nothing but hope and determination. Julia, he said quietly, whatever happens with your cousin, you should know that you and Emma have a place here for as long as you need it, not just until spring. Her eyes widened slightly. Matthew, that's very kind, but it's not kindness, he interrupted. It's selfish, actually. The boys need you. He stopped, unable to finish the thought. It was too soon, too raw. Just know that you're welcome here, both of you. Julia's eyes glistened in the lamplight. Thank you, she whispered. That means more than you know. The storm finally broke on the fourth day, leaving behind a transformed landscape. The snow was piled so high that Matthew had to dig a path from the door to the barn. The boys, ecstatic at the winter wonderland, begged to go sledding on the hill behind the cabin. Can we, Pa, please? Joseph pleaded, his face pressed against the frosted window. Matthew looked at the mountain of chores that needed doing: paths to clear, animals to check, firewood to chop, and started to shake his head. I think sledding sounds wonderful, Julia interjected, smiling at the boys' hopeful faces. Why don't I take them while you tend to the livestock? Emma's napping and we won't go far. Matthew hesitated, torn between responsibility and the rare sight of his son's excitement. Are you sure? The snow's deep and I grew up in Minnesota, Julia assured him with a laugh. I know snow. And I was quite the sledder in my day. And so Matthew found himself watching from the barn as Julia, bundled in Caroline's old woolen cloak, led his sons up the hill, pulling the wooden sled behind them. Their laughter carried on the crisp air as they took turns sliding down the slope, their cheeks red with cold and excitement. Later, as they all sat around the fire drinking the hot chocolate, Julia had prepared another luxury they'd gone without for too long. Matthew realized he was smiling, really smiling for the first time in years. You should come with us next time, Pa, David said, his eyes bright with the day's adventure. Maybe I will, Matthew replied, surprising himself as much as his sons. That night, as had become their custom, they gathered for evening prayers. The boys no longer needed prompting to fold their hands and bow their heads. Julia had transformed this ritual from an awkward obligation into a meaningful family moment. Dear Lord, Julia began, we thank you for the beauty of fresh snow, for the joy of sledding down hills, and for the warmth of this home against the winter cold. Each boy added his thanks: Samuel for the hot chocolate, David for finding his lost mitten, Joseph for the snow angel Julia had helped him make. When it came to Matthew's turn, he found himself speaking from a place deeper than he'd allowed himself to go for a long time. I'm thankful for second chances, he said quietly. For unexpected blessings that come disguised as broken wagon wheels, for laughter returning to this house, for hope. He didn't look at Julia as he spoke, but he felt her presence across the table like a physical warmth. When he finally raised his eyes to meet hers, the understanding he saw there nearly undid him. Amen, she whispered, and the words seemed to seal something between them, unspoken but real. Christmas approached, bringing with it a flurry of secret preparations. Julia enlisted the boys in making small gifts for their father: a carved wooden bookmark from Samuel, a new handkerchief embroidered by David with considerable help, and a drawing from Joseph. Matthew, for his part, worked late into the evenings in the barn, crafting a small rocking chair for Emma and wooden toys for his sons. For Julia, he labored over a special gift, one that required a rare trip into town despite the snow-covered roads. The journey was arduous, but necessary both for the gift and for the question that had been forming in his mind since the night of the snowstorm. Christmas Eve arrived clear and cold, with stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. After a simple but festive dinner, they gathered around the small pine tree the boys had helped Matthew cut and bring inside. Julia had decorated it with paper ornaments and strings of dried berries, and it stood in the corner of the main room like a symbol of the transformation their lives had undergone. Can we open presents now, Pa? Joseph asked, bouncing on his toes with excitement. One tonight, Matthew decided. The rest tomorrow morning. The boys chose to open the small packages from Julia, hand-knitted mittens in different colors for each of them. They immediately pulled them on, showing each other the special details. Julia had added a star for Samuel, a horse for David, and a tree for Joseph. These are real nice, Miss Julia, Samuel said solemnly. Thank you, you're very welcome, Julia replied, clearly touched by their appreciation. Matthew cleared his throat. I have something for Emma, he said, bringing forward the small rocking chair he'd made. It was polished smooth, with delicate carvings of flowers around the edges. Julia's hand flew to her mouth. Oh, Matthew, it's beautiful. She's too little for it now, he acknowledged, but she'll grow into it. The implication that Emma would be around long enough to use the chair hung in the air between them. And this, Matthew continued, reaching into his pocket, is for you. He handed Julia a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a piece of red yarn, the best he could do with what was available. Julia untied it carefully, folding back the paper to reveal a silver locket on a delicate chain. Matthew, she breathed, lifting it to catch the light from the fire. It's exquisite. Open it, he urged softly. Inside, he had placed a tiny sketch of Emma that he'd commissioned from the portrait artist who occasionally passed through town. On the other side was a small piece of paper with the words for new beginnings written in his rough hand. Julia looked up at him, her eyes swimming with tears. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Matthew assured her. Just know that we want you to stay, both of you. Not just until spring. Before Julia could respond, Joseph piped up. Does that mean Miss Julia's gonna be our new ma? A charged silence fell over the room. The question that had been circling them for weeks had finally been spoken aloud with the innocent directness only a child could manage. Joseph, Matthew began, embarrassment coloring his voice, but Julia knelt down beside the boy, her expression serious but gentle. Joseph, your mother will always be your mother. No one can replace her, but... She glanced up at Matthew, a question in her eyes. Matthew stepped forward, emboldened by the moment and the season, and the feeling that had been growing in his heart since that snowy night when Julia had appeared at his door. What I think your father is trying to say, Julia continued, looking back at Joseph but speaking to all three boys, is that sometimes God gives us second chances at family, different but still full of love. Is that what you want, Pa? Samuel asked, his young face earnest and hopeful in a way Matthew hadn't seen since before Caroline died. Matthew looked at his sons, at baby Emma cooing in her makeshift cradle, and finally at Julia, her face illuminated by the glow of the Christmas tree candles. Yes, he said simply. That's what I want, but it's not just up to me. All eyes turned to Julia, who was still kneeling beside Joseph, the locket clutched in her hand. I came here running away from one life, she said slowly. I never expected to find another, but in these few weeks you've all become. She paused, searching for the right words. You've become the answer to prayers I was afraid to pray. Is that a yes? David asked impatiently. Julia laughed, the sound like bells in the quiet room. It's a yes, if your father is properly asking what I think he's asking. Matthew stepped forward and took her hand, helping her to her feet. Julia Wilson, will you stay here with us, not as our guest, but as my wife and these boys' mother? Will you help me teach them prayers and show them kindness and fill this house with the warmth it's been missing? Yes, Julia whispered, tears spilling onto her cheeks. Yes to all of it. The boys erupted in cheers, even Samuel allowing his usual reserve to give way to genuine excitement. Matthew, overwhelmed by the moment, leaned forward and gently kissed Julia's cheek, a promise of more to come when they weren't surrounded by three enthusiastic boys. When can you get married? Samuel asked, practical as always. The circuit preacher won't be through until spring, Matthew explained, but we can have a proper ceremony then. But Miss Julia will stay now, right? Joseph confirmed, his small face serious. And be our ma right away, Julia looked to Matthew, who nodded. We'll make our promises to each other tonight, he said, before God and you boys, and when the preacher comes, we'll make them official. Then we should pray about it, David declared with certainty. That's what Ma would say, important things need praying over, Julia smiled through her tears. David's right, shall we? And so, on Christmas Eve, they knelt together beside the simple pine tree Matthew, Julia with Emma in her arms, and the three boys, their heads bowed in the soft candlelight. Dear Lord, Julia began, her voice steady despite the emotion of the moment. We thank you for bringing us together, for healing broken hearts, and for the gift of new beginnings. We thank you for Miss Julia and baby Emma, Samuel added, more animated than he'd been in prayers before. And for Pa not being sad anymore, David contributed. And for making us a real family again, Joseph finished. Matthew, his heart too full for many words, simply said, "Thank you for answered prayers, Lord, even the ones I didn't know how to ask." Amen, they all said together, the word no longer a hollow conclusion but a true affirmation. As they rose from their knees, the small cabin seemed transformed not by any physical change, but by the palpable sense of hope that now filled it. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and gentle, covering the Montana landscape in a clean blanket of white. Inside, the embers of grief had given way to the warm flame of new love, kindled on a winter's night when a lost woman had knocked on a widower's door. "Merry Christmas," Julia said softly, her hand finding Matthew's. "Merry Christmas," he replied, squeezing her fingers. "The first of many." And in that moment, surrounded by his sons and the woman who had brought light back into their darkness, Matthew Ingram knew with absolute certainty that the long winter ahead would be the beginning, not an end. The beginning of healing, of wholeness, of a family remade. The winter months passed in a blur of domestic harmony that still occasionally surprised Matthew when he stopped to consider it. January brought bitter cold, but found the newly formed family snug in their cabin, with Julia transforming their simple dwelling into a true home. February's blizzards howled outside while inside, laughter and learning filled the rooms. By March, as the first hints of spring began to appear in the lengthening days and occasional patches of bare ground, Matthew could hardly remember what life had been like before Julia and Emma had come into their lives. The rhythm of their days had settled into a comfortable pattern. Mornings began with Matthew tending to the livestock while Julia prepared breakfast. The boys would complete their chores before sitting down to the schooling Julia provided, reading from the few books they possessed, practicing their figures on slate boards, and learning history and geography through Julia's engaging stories. Afternoons were for outdoor work when the weather permitted, cutting and hauling firewood, checking fence lines, and beginning preparations for spring planting. Evenings were for family time, reading aloud, playing simple games, singing songs around the fire, and always ending with prayers led by Julia, with all of them kneeling together. It was during these evening prayers that Matthew noticed the most profound change in his sons. Under Julia's gentle guidance, they had moved from reluctant participants to eager contributors, each finding his own voice in expressing gratitude and hopes. Even Samuel, who had been moving toward a prickly adolescence, seemed to find comfort in the nightly ritual. One evening in late March, as the family knelt for prayers, Joseph made an observation that caught Matthew by surprise. "Miss Julia," he said thoughtfully, "you pray different than Ma did, but I like it just as much." Julia's hand, which had been resting on the boy's shoulder, tightened slightly. "Thank you, Joseph, that's a very kind thing to say." "How did your mother pray?" Samuel asked, looking at Matthew. "I can't remember exactly." Matthew cleared his throat, caught off guard by the question. "Your mother, Caroline, she knew many prayers by heart. From the prayer book her family brought from back east. She was raised in the church, you see." "But you weren't?" David asked curiously. "No," Matthew admitted. "My family moved around too much. My pa was more concerned with finding the next patch of land or the next herd of cattle than with finding a church." He glanced at Julia, suddenly self-conscious. "That's why I was never very good at leading prayers, never learned how properly." Julia's eyes held no judgment, only understanding. "There's no right or wrong way to pray," she said gently. "God hears our hearts, not just our words." "Ma said something like that once," Samuel remembered, his young face solemn, "when I asked her why we had to say the same words every night. Your mother was a wise woman," Julia said. "And I'm sure she'd be very proud of the fine young men you're all becoming." That night, after the boys were asleep and Emma was settled, Matthew found Julia sitting by the fire, mending one of Samuel's shirts. The flames cast a warm glow on her face, highlighting the gentle curve of her cheek and the wisp of hair that had escaped her braid. Looking at her, Matthew felt a wave of gratitude so intense it was almost painful. "You're remarkable," he said softly, taking the chair opposite her. Julia looked up, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "Why do you say that? The way you handled the boys' questions tonight, about their mother, about prayer, you never try to replace Caroline in their memories, but you're building your own place in their hearts." Julia set her mending aside. "I would never want to erase their memories of her. She'll always be their mother, but I hope," she hesitated, "I hope there's room for me too." "There's more than room," Matthew assured her, reaching across to take her hand. "You've become essential to them, to all of us." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, hands linked across the space between their chairs. Since Christmas Eve, their relationship had deepened, though propriety and the constant presence of the children had kept their physical expressions of affection limited to brief touches and the occasional chaste kiss. "The snow's nearly gone from the south pasture," Matthew observed, changing the subject to the practical matter that had been on his mind. "I was thinking we could ride into town next week, stock up on supplies before the spring work begins in earnest. And perhaps speak to Sheriff Jensen about our situation." "Our situation," Julia echoed, a hint of anxiety crossing her features. "About the wedding," Matthew clarified. "The circuit preacher usually comes through in April. Sheriff Jensen keeps track of when he's expected. I thought we might make arrangements." Julia's expression cleared. "Oh, yes, of course," Matthew studied her face. "Unless you've had second thoughts about staying, about marrying me." "No," Julia said quickly, squeezing his hand. "Not at all, it's just—" She hesitated, then continued in a rush. "Matthew, there's something I haven't told you about why I left Billings." Matthew felt a flicker of concern. "You said it was because of limited options for a widow with a child." "That's part of it," Julia acknowledged, "but there's more." She took a deep breath. "Thomas, my husband, owed money, gambling debts. After he died, a man named Harlan Blackwood started coming around, saying I was responsible for paying what Thomas owed." Matthew's jaw tightened. "That's not how it works. A widow isn't legally bound by her husband's gambling debts." "I know that," Julia said, "but Blackwood didn't care about the law. He was persistent, said if I couldn't pay with money, there were other ways to settle the debt." Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "When Emma was born, he started suggesting that when she was older, she could work in his saloon to pay off what was owed. That's when I knew I had to leave. I couldn't let my daughter grow up with that hanging over her." Matthew felt a cold anger building in his chest. This Blackwood. "Did he follow you?" Julia shook her head. "I don't think so. I left in the middle of the night, told no one where I was going, but still, I worry. He's not the type to forget a debt, real or imagined." "Julia," Matthew said firmly, "you're safe here, you and Emma both. No one from Billings is going to find you, and if by some chance they did, they'd have to go through me first." Julia's smile was tremulous. "That's why I didn't tell you before. I didn't want to bring trouble to your door. You and the boys have been through enough." "Whatever comes, we face it together," Matthew insisted. "That's what family does." The word family hung in the air between them, weighty with meaning and promise. "So," Matthew continued after a moment, "town next week. You and the boys can come along. Might be nice for you to meet some of our neighbors before the wedding." Julia nodded, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "I'd like that, and Emma could use some new clothes. She's growing so fast." "We can afford it," Matthew assured her. "The cattle herd looks good, and I've put aside some money from last year's sale. Besides," he added with a small smile, "a man should be able to provide a proper dress for his bride." Julia's blush deepened. "I don't need anything fancy." "Maybe not," Matthew conceded, "but you deserve it." The trip to town the following week was an adventure for the entire family. The wagon, repaired over the winter, creaked its way along the muddy spring roads with all 6 of them aboard Matthew driving. Julia beside him with Emma on her lap, and the 3 boys crowded in the back, pointing out every new sign of spring they spotted along the way. Pine Creek, the nearest town, was a small but growing settlement with a main street boasting a general store, a blacksmith, a small hotel with a dining room, the sheriff's office, and the inevitable saloon. A few modest houses dotted the surrounding area, home to the families who supported themselves through a combination of small farms, cattle ranching, and serving the needs of travelers passing through on their way further west. As they pulled up in front of the general store, Matthew noticed the curious glances from the few people on the street. News traveled slowly in the winter, and most of the town probably hadn't heard about Julia yet. "Ready?" he asked her quietly, noting the apprehension in her posture. Julia squared her shoulders and nodded. "Ready." The bell above the door jingled as they entered the general store, where Mrs. Patterson, the proprietor's wife, was arranging bolts of fabric on a shelf. She turned at the sound, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of the Ingram family plus two unfamiliar faces. "Matthew Ingram," she exclaimed. "Haven't seen you since before the first snow, and the boys, my, how they've grown." Her gaze shifted to Julia and Emma. "And who might these lovely ladies be?" Matthew cleared his throat. "Mrs. Patterson, this is Julia Wilson and her daughter, Emma. That is, Julia and I are to be married when Preacher Collins comes through next month." Mrs. Patterson's face registered surprise, then delight. "Well, that is news indeed. Congratulations to you both." She bustled forward to clasp Julia's hand. "My dear, how wonderful to meet you. We'd all but given up hope of Matthew finding someone to help with those boys of his." "Thank you," Julia replied with a polite smile. "It's lovely to meet you as well." "Now you must tell me everything," Mrs. Patterson continued, steering Julia toward the counter. "How did you two meet? Where are you from? And what can we get for you today?" Matthew, recognizing the beginning of what would likely be a lengthy conversation, turned to the boys. "Why don't we leave Miss Julia to talk with Mrs. Patterson for a bit? We can go see Sheriff Jensen about the preacher while the ladies do their shopping." The boys, more interested in seeing the sheriff's office than in listening to women's talk, readily agreed. Matthew gave Julia a reassuring nod before ushering his sons back out onto the street. Sheriff Jensen was outside his office, whittling a piece of wood in the spring sunshine. He looked up as Matthew and the boys approached, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "Ingram. Brought the whole tribe to town, I see." "Not quite the whole tribe," Matthew replied, shaking the sheriff's hand. "That's partly why I'm here. Wanted to ask about Preacher Collins, when he's expected through next." Jensen tucked his knife into his pocket. "Planning on having those boys baptized at last, are you?" "Planning on getting married," Matthew corrected, unable to keep a small smile from his face. The sheriff's bushy eyebrows shot up. "Married? Well, I'll be. Who's the lucky lady?" "Her name is Julia Wilson. She and her daughter are over at Patterson's now." "Wilson," Jensen repeated, his brow furrowing slightly. "Don't believe I know any Wilsons in these parts." "She's not from here," Matthew explained. "Her wagon broke down near our place just before the first big snow. She and her daughter stayed the winter and, well..." He shrugged, slightly embarrassed but undeniably pleased. "Things developed from there." Jensen grinned. "Best news I've heard all month. Preachers due first week of April if the passes are clear. I'll make sure he knows to prepare for a wedding." "Much obliged," Matthew said. "And Sheriff, there's one other matter." While the boys explored the small jail cell with its single bunk and barred window, Matthew quietly explained Julia's situation with Harlan Blackwood in Billings. Jensen listened carefully, his expression growing serious. "Blackwood, name sounds familiar. Might have had some dealings with the sheriff over in Billings about him. Nothing good. Julia's worried he might come looking for her," Matthew said. "I told her it's unlikely after all this time, but still. I'll keep an ear out," Jensen promised. "And if anyone matching his description comes through asking questions, I'll head him off. Your lady and her little one have nothing to fear, not in Pine Creek." "Thank you," Matthew said, relieved. "I appreciate it." When they returned to the general store, they found Julia surrounded by parcels of flour, sugar, coffee, fabric, and a small selection of candies for the boys. Mrs. Patterson was showing her a bolt of cream-colored cotton with tiny blue flowers scattered across it. "Wouldn't this make a lovely wedding dress?" Mrs. Patterson was saying as Matthew approached. "Simple but elegant, and the blue would bring out your eyes." Julia looked up at Matthew, a question in her expression. "What do you think? Mrs. Patterson says it wouldn't take long to make up." I think you'd look beautiful in it, Matthew said honestly, and anything else you choose. Mrs. Patterson beamed at them both. Oh, it does my heart good to see a family coming together like this. And Matthew, Julia's been telling me she's got the boys learning their lessons proper. Samuel's reading at grade level now, she says. Matthew's chest swelled with pride both in his son's progress and in Julia's evident care for their education. She's a natural teacher. The boys have learned more this winter than in the 2 years prior. The rest of their time in town passed pleasantly. They treated the family to dinner at the small hotel restaurant, a rare luxury that had the boys on their best behavior, eager to impress. They met several other townspeople, all of whom greeted the news of the upcoming wedding with genuine pleasure. By the time they loaded their purchases into the wagon and began the journey home, Julia seemed more relaxed than she had been all day. Everyone was so kind, she remarked as the wagon rumbled along the muddy road. I wasn't sure what to expect. What did you expect? Matthew asked curiously. Julia hesitated. In Billings, after Thomas died, there was gossip, speculation about how I would support myself and the baby. Some of the women, they weren't very welcoming. Pine Creek's different, Matthew assured her. Smaller, people look out for each other here. Mrs. Patterson invited me to join the ladies' sewing circle once we're settled, Julia said, a note of wonder in her voice. She said they meet once a month, take turns hosting. Matthew smiled, pleased to see her excitement. You should go, it would be good for you to have friends nearby. And the boys and I can manage for an afternoon without you. Julia looked down at Emma, who was sleeping contentedly in her arms. It's strange, she said softly. A few months ago, I was alone in the world except for this little one, with nothing but uncertainty ahead. And now you have a family, Matthew finished for her, and a community. Yes, Julia agreed, her eyes meeting his. A family. The circuit preacher, a balding man with kind eyes and a perpetually rumpled suit, arrived in Pine Creek on a sunny April morning. The news spread quickly through the small community, and by afternoon, Sheriff Jensen had confirmed that Preacher Collins was available to perform the Ingram-Wilson wedding the following day. The preparations at the ranch reached a fever pitch. Julia, with help from Mrs. Patterson and 2 other women from town who had ridden out for the occasion, put the finishing touches on her simple wedding dress. The boys scrubbed the cabin from top to bottom under Matthew's supervision, while he alternated between nervous pacing and checking on the fatted calf he was roasting for the celebration afterward. By unspoken agreement, Matthew spent the night before the wedding in the barn, maintaining at least the appearance of propriety until the ceremony made their union official. As he lay on a makeshift bed of hay, staring up at the rafters, he found himself thinking of Caroline. I hope you'd approve, he whispered into the darkness. The boys need a mother, and I need her too. He paused, emotion tightening his throat. I'll always keep your memory alive for them, but it's time for us to live again, really live. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, the Montana spring in full glory. Wildflowers dotted the meadows, and the snow-capped mountains stood crisp against the blue sky. By mid-morning, wagons began arriving, neighbors from miles around, drawn by the rarity of a social occasion and the promise of a celebratory meal afterward. Matthew, freshly shaved and wearing his best shirt with a new vest Julia had somehow found time to make him, stood nervously on the porch greeting guests. The boys, scrubbed clean and wearing their Sunday clothes, hovered nearby, alternating between excitement and solemn awareness of the day's importance. At precisely noon, Mrs. Patterson emerged from the cabin and gave a nod to Sheriff Jensen, who had been pressed into service as a makeshift master of ceremonies. The sheriff cleared his throat and called for everyone's attention. Folks, if you'll all gather round, the ceremony is about to begin. The 30 or so guests formed a loose semicircle in front of the cabin. Preacher Collins took his position, Bible in hand, and Matthew stepped forward to stand beside him, his heart pounding. A hush fell over the gathering as the cabin door opened and Julia appeared, Emma in her arms. Her dress was simple but lovely, the cream-colored cotton setting off her golden hair, which had been arranged in a loose chignon with a few flowers tucked into it. But it was her face that captivated Matthew, radiant with happiness, her blue eyes shining with promise. Mrs. Patterson took Emma from her arms, and the three Ingram boys stepped forward to escort Julia to their father. It had been Julia's idea, a way to signify that this union was about creating a family, not just joining two people. "Ready, boys?" Julia whispered, offering each of them a hand while Samuel walked solemnly ahead. As they approached, Matthew felt a lump forming in his throat. His sons, leading this woman who had brought light back into their lives, who had knelt beside them in prayer and taught them to express their hearts. His soon-to-be wife, who had appeared on his doorstep on a snowy night and changed everything. Preacher Collins smiled at the unconventional procession. "Who gives this woman to be married to this man?" he asked, following the traditional formula. Samuel, who had been carefully coached, stepped forward. "We do, sir, her new family." A murmur of appreciation rippled through the guests, and more than one handkerchief was discreetly pressed to damp eyes. The ceremony itself was brief but heartfelt. Matthew and Julia exchanged vows, promising to love, honor, and cherish each other for all their days. When it came time for the ring, Matthew pulled from his pocket a simple gold band, another purchase from his trip to town, made in secret. "With this ring I thee wed," he said, his voice steady as he slid it onto her finger. "By the authority vested in me," Preacher Collins declared, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Before the preacher could invite him to kiss his bride, Joseph piped up from where he stood between his brothers. "Does this mean we call you Ma now?" he asked Julia, his young voice carrying clearly in the hushed gathering. Julia knelt down to the boy's level, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "If you'd like to," she said softly, "I would be honored, but only if you're ready." Joseph didn't hesitate. He threw his arms around her neck. "I'm ready. I've been ready for a long time." David quickly joined the embrace, while Samuel, ever more reserved, simply reached out to squeeze Julia's hand. But the gesture held as much acceptance and love as his brother's more demonstrative actions. Matthew, watching the scene unfold, felt his own eyes grow damp. This was what he had prayed for in his clumsy, uncertain way, not just a wife for himself, but a mother for his sons. A complete family once more. When Julia rose to her feet again, her cheeks wet with tears of joy, Matthew finally claimed his kiss, gentle and proper in front of the assembled guests, but with a promise of deeper passion to come. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening. The roasted calf was supplemented by dishes brought by neighbors, pies and cakes, fresh bread, early spring vegetables. There was music from a makeshift band, dancing on the packed earth of the yard, and a general air of festivity that Pine Creek had not seen in many a season. As twilight descended, guests began to depart, leaving behind well wishes and the remnants of the feast. Mrs. Patterson, the last to leave, handed a sleepy Emma back to Julia with a knowing smile. "Congratulations, Mrs. Ingram," she said, the new name sounding both strange and right to Julia's ears. "I'll expect you at the sewing circle next month." "I'll be there," Julia promised. And then, finally, they were alone, Matthew, Julia, Emma, and the three boys, a family made official by law and ceremony, though in truth they had become 1 month before on a snowy Christmas Eve. "Time for bed, boys," Matthew said gently. "It's been a long day." There were token protests, but the excitement had worn them out, and soon all three were tucked into their beds. Emma, too, was settled in her cradle, now moved permanently into the room Matthew and Julia would share as husband and wife. "She'll sleep through the night," Julia assured Matthew as they stood looking down at the peaceful infant. "She usually does now." Matthew nodded, suddenly shy in this new context. Despite the months of living under the same roof, of growing closer day by day, this was different, official. Permanent. Julia seemed to sense his hesitation. She reached up to touch his cheek, her new ring catching the lamplight. "Husband," she said softly, testing the word. "Wife," he returned, covering her hand with his own. "My wife." And then he was kissing her properly, deeply, with all the passion and tenderness he had held in check during the long winter months. Julia responded in kind, her body melting against his, her arms winding around his neck. Later, much later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness, Julia's head resting on his chest, Matthew found himself thinking again of the night she had appeared at his door. How close he had come to turning away, to missing this chance at happiness. "What are you thinking about?" Julia murmured, sensing his wakefulness. "About prayers," Matthew replied truthfully. "About how God answers them, even when we don't know what we're asking for." Julia propped herself up on one elbow to look at him, her hair falling in a curtain around her face. "And what was your prayer?" Matthew considered for a moment. I think I was praying for someone to teach my boys to pray, really pray from the heart, but what I got was so much more," Julia smiled in the darkness. "My prayer was for safety, for Emma, for myself, somewhere we could belong." She leaned down to kiss him gently. "I got so much more too." Outside, a spring breeze rustled through the new leaves, carrying the promise of the season to come. Inside, Matthew pulled his wife close, thankful beyond words for broken wagon wheels, early snowstorms, and the mysterious ways of providence that had brought this woman to kneel beside him and his sons in prayer, and in so doing, had taught them all how to live and love again. 5 years later, the sound of children's laughter floated across the meadow as Matthew Ingram paused in his work, straightening his back and wiping sweat from his brow. The ranch had prospered in the years since his marriage to Julia, expanding to include more cattle, better outbuildings, and an addition to the main cabin that now housed their growing family. From his vantage point near the corral, he could see them all: Samuel, now 15 and nearly as tall as Matthew himself, helping Julia hang laundry on the line. David and Joseph chasing each other around the yard, their shouts punctuated by the delighted squeals of 5-year-old Emma and her 3-year-old brother, Thomas, named for Julia's first husband in a gesture of respect that had meant the world to her. And there, seated on a blanket in the shade of the big cottonwood tree, was their newest addition, baby Caroline, just 6 months old, cooing contentedly as she watched her siblings play. Matthew's heart swelled at the sight. 5 years had transformed not just the ranch, but all their lives. Samuel was showing promise as a natural horseman and had recently begun talking about starting his own herd someday. David, at 13, had discovered a talent for numbers and helped Matthew keep the ranch books. 10-year-old Joseph still had his mischievous streak, but had also developed a gentle way with animals that suggested he might have a gift for veterinary work. And his Julia had bloomed in ways he could never have imagined that snowy night when she first appeared at his door. She had become not just the heart of their home, but a respected figure in the community. Her sewing circle had evolved into a proper ladies' auxiliary that raised funds for the new schoolhouse in Pine Creek. She taught there 2 days a week, bringing baby Caroline along, while Mrs. Patterson watched Thomas and Emma. The sound of an approaching rider drew Matthew's attention. A lone horseman was coming up the road, and for a brief moment, old habits made him tense. But those fears had faded over the years. Harlan Blackwood had never appeared to trouble them, and Sheriff Jensen had later heard the man had met his end in a dispute over cards in a butt saloon, a fitting end, perhaps, for someone who had lived by intimidation and threats. As the rider drew closer, Matthew recognized Sheriff Jensen himself and raised a hand in greeting. "Sheriff, what brings you out this way?" Jensen dismounted, looking as weathered as ever but with the same friendly smile. "Delivering mail," he explained, pulling an envelope from his saddlebag. "Express rider brought it to town yesterday, marked urgent for Mrs. Ingram." Matthew frowned slightly. Julia rarely received mail, having no family left besides her cousin Charlotte in Helena, with whom she exchanged occasional letters. "Julia," he called, gesturing her over. She came quickly, wiping her hands on her apron, a question in her eyes as she saw the sheriff. "Mail for you," Matthew explained, taking the baby from the blanket so Julia could read her letter undistracted. Julia took the envelope, examining the handwriting with a puzzled expression. "It's from Charlotte," she said, breaking the seal. Her eyes moved rapidly over the page, and Matthew watched as surprise, then what appeared to be shock crossed her features. "What is it?" he asked, concerned. "Is something wrong?" Julia looked up, her eyes wide. "Charlotte's husband died last winter, influenza. She's been managing their dry goods store alone, but it's too much for her. She's asking if we might consider moving to Helena to help her." Matthew felt a momentary pang of alarm. Leave the ranch, the home they'd built together. "It was unthinkable." "I'll write her back," Julia continued, seeming to sense his concern. "Explain that we can't possibly leave, but perhaps Samuel could go for a summer, help her hire someone suitable. He's old enough for such a responsibility, and it would be good experience for him." Relief washed over Matthew. "That sounds sensible and generous. Samuel might enjoy the adventure." Julia refolded the letter thoughtfully. "She says the town is growing rapidly. There's a real church now with a permanent minister, schools, shops." She paused, looking around at their homestead, the sturdy cabin with its new addition, the well-tended fields, the healthy cattle grazing in the distance. "But this is our home." "Yes, it is," Matthew agreed, shifting baby Caroline to his other arm as she began to fuss. "We've put down roots here." "Made a life." Sheriff Jensen, who had been quietly observing this exchange, cleared his throat. "Well, I should be getting back to town. Julia, if you want to send a reply with me, I can see it goes out with tomorrow's express rider." "Thank you, Sheriff. I'll have it ready in a few minutes." "Would you like some coffee while you wait, or perhaps a piece of pie I baked this morning?" Jensen's weathered face creased in a smile. "Now, Mrs. Ingram, you know I've never been known to refuse your pie." As Julia headed toward the cabin, the older children trailing after her at the mention of pie, Jensen turned to Matthew. "You've done well for yourself, Ingram, real well." Matthew nodded, looking around at the ranch and, more importantly, at his family. "We have, by the grace of God, we have. Remember when I first met that bride of yours? Wedding day, was it? Never seen a man look at a woman quite the way you looked at her, like you couldn't believe your good fortune." Matthew laughed softly. "Still can't most days. And those boys of yours, taking to her right from the start." "Especially that one," Jensen nodded toward Joseph, who was holding the door for his siblings. "Asking right there in the ceremony if he could call her Ma." "They needed her," Matthew said simply. "We all did." The baby in his arms began to fuss in earnest now, her small face scrunching up in preparation for a proper cry. Matthew bounced her gently, but she was not to be consoled. "Someone's hungry," Jensen observed with the wisdom of a grandfather several times over. "She certainly is," Julia agreed, returning from the cabin in time to hear his comment. She reached for the baby, who immediately quieted in her mother's arms. "Samuel's cutting pie for everyone, Sheriff. He'll bring yours out presently." As Jensen headed toward the porch where the other children were gathering, Julia lingered, Caroline nestled contentedly against her. "You're not worried about Charlotte's letter?" Matthew asked, studying his wife's face. "No," Julia said firmly. "This is where we belong, all of us." She glanced toward the cabin, where Samuel was now distributing slices of pie. "Though I do think it might be good for Samuel to spend some time in Helena. He's becoming a man, and the experience would broaden his horizons." Matthew nodded, once again impressed by his wife's wisdom when it came to their children. "We'll talk to him about it, see what he thinks." They stood together for a moment in comfortable silence, watching their family, the older boys teasing Emma, little Thomas trying to mimic his brother's every move, the sheriff regaling them all with some tale that had them laughing. "You ever think about that first night?" Julia asked suddenly. "When I appeared at your door in the snowstorm," often, Matthew admitted. "What if I'd turned you away? What if your wheel hadn't broken? So many small chances that brought us together." "Not chances," Julia corrected gently. "Providence." Matthew smiled, remembering the evening prayers that had once been so difficult for him, that had become the cornerstone of their family life. "Prayer, you mean?" "Yes," Julia agreed, her free hand finding his. "Even the prayers we didn't know we were praying." As they walked together toward the porch, where their children waited, Matthew reflected on the journey that had brought them here from a broken-wheeled wagon and a widower's lonely cabin to this thriving ranch and family. From awkward, uncertain prayer to the deep faith that now sustained them all. The cowboy who had tried to teach his boys to pray had found, in the end, that the greatest lesson had come when she knelt beside them all, showing them not just how to speak to God, but how to love, how to heal, how to become whole again. And for that, Matthew Ingram would be eternally grateful.